So next is another stunning example of who we get to see within just a couple of feet because he's here in town for South by. Dr. David Bray is the Chief Technology Officer for the FCC. You heard those initials right. He's a really big deal. But he also, in addition to really understanding the technology behind things, what I really care and love most about David is that he really cares about the people in front of it as well. He is also an Eisenhower Fellowship, which is how we got to know each other, and very, very excited to introduce you to Dr. David Bray. David.
All right, so how is everybody doing today? Can I hear how you're doing? Chilly? All right, let's try and get some energy up. Can this side of the room shout out the word change? Change. This side of the room say agent. That was kind of weak. You can do better. Change. Try to be a little louder. And now together, change agents. So, it is an honor and a privilege to address you because what I want to leave you with is you all know the phrase, think globally, act locally. I want to flip it a bit and actually recommend that we act locally, but we think locally because the future is cities. The future is us living together in large amounts of people, unprecedented in the history of our species. If you think about it, 50,000 years ago, if you are a human, on average, you ran into at most 80 people in the entire course of your life, and most of them were your family members. That is no longer the state of the planet we're on today. You probably are running into less than 80 people, and again, they're not your family members, in the next hour, let alone your entire lifespan. And this creates interesting challenges. And so, as mentioned, I do technology. I'm the Chief Information Officer at the FCC, but I'm also an Eisenhower Fellow, and I think about how do we make decisions about how we use technology. Because at the end of the day, technology itself is amoral. Fire can be used for good, fire can be used for bad. Same thing with rocks. You can use it to build a nice wall, and that wall can be protective, but it can also be divisive. The wall can also have rocks that can be used to kill people. Same thing is true with digital technology as well. It's neither good nor bad, it's how we humans choose how to use it that decides whether it's good or bad. And that gets to the importance of change agents. Anybody can be a change agent. You don't have to wait until you have implicit authority to be one. All you have to be willing to do is step outside the status quo, but have a strategy for how you're going to do that. I see a lot of people that are challenging the status quo, that are trying to buck the system, but they're creating a whole lot of heat and light. They're not actually moving things forward in a meaningful way. And I raise that because we often confuse the difference between management and leadership. Management is when you do what's expected of you, whether it's by your boss, your peers, your reports, your neighbors, the public, the Congress, or the administration. We all have to meet expectations to a degree, else we will probably be out of a job. But that said, if all we do is meet expectations, we're not going to meet this unprecedented amount of change that's happening in our lives. 2013, there were 7 billion network devices on the face of the planet, 7 billion human beings on the planet as well. Less than 2 years later, by 2015, there is now 14 billion network devices on the face of the planet and only 7.3 billion human beings. By 2022, less than 5 years from now, upwards of 75 to 300 billion network devices on the face of the planet relative to only 8 billion human beings. The amount of data is also doubling every 2 years. 2013, there was 4 billion terabytes. To put that in perspective, the Library of Congress is 10 terabytes of data on the face of the planet. So 400 million versions of the Library of Congress in 2013. It's doubling less than every 2 years. So that again, in less than 5 years, by 2022, there will be 9.6 billion versions of the Library of Congress of digital data on the face of the planet. I would submit to you that the way we currently search for data will no longer work because how many of us here go past the 3rd or 4th pages of search results? We don't go past it. We will lose things. We will miss things that can make our lives better. We will also miss things that can help us avoid bad things from happening. And again, this is the human condition. At the end of the day, we have limited attention spans. We do have to eat. We do have to sleep. Technology is amoral. It can improve our lives dramatically, but it's also worth noting that web search, social media, and GPS, unfortunately, was the same technology used to plan and actually carry out the Mumbai terrorist attacks and figure out, unfortunately, who to execute. So technology is both good and bad. We've got to make choices, and it's coming to us at an accelerating rate. Now, I want to play a game, so I first need to see, is anyone willing to volunteer in playing this game with me? All right, can I get your name, please? Jennifer, thank you for volunteering. So, Jennifer, and I need one more volunteer too to come even here. What's your name, sir? Chris. All right, so Jennifer and Chris have been the willful volunteers that have stepped forward. Thank you very much. Jennifer, I'm going to play a game in which I'm going to offer you $100. But you have to offer a percentage of it to Chris.
Okay.
And you don't know Chris, right? We didn't plan this beforehand.
No, I don't know.
All right, just checking. All right, so you have to offer a percentage of that $100 to Chris, and if he accepts your offer, you both get to keep your money. But if he rejects it, you don't get anything. Nor does Chris. So, of the $100, what percentage of the $100 are you going to offer to Chris?
Wait, if he accepts it,
You both get a percentage. So, like, let's say you offer, say, $30 to Chris, and he says yes. You get 70, he gets 30. If he says no, neither of you get anything. So how much do you offer of the $100? He doesn't have to accept. He can reject. You give him 50%? Do you accept 50%? Chris accepts. Congratulations. Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to up the ante and say it's $1 million. What percentage of the $1 million do you offer to Chris? 50% as well. Chris, do you accept?
Well, more than
Yeah. Except you'd have a lot of friends at South by Southwest, I imagine, after that. So, so anybody know what would have been the answer that economics would have said would have been the rational amount for Jennifer to offer and the rational amount for Chris to accept? No. 1 penny, exactly. Because having 1 penny is better than nothing. But Jennifer knew intuitively that if she went too low, Chris is probably going to reject it. And so I share that, not to fault economics, but to point out that it is based on principles from the 19th century in which you could not know in real time the economic behaviors of everyone. And so it is a normative theory, it is not an empirical theory. In fact, to put this in perspective, primates don't really like cucumbers, but if you give them cucumbers, they'll eat them. They'll eat them up until the point where they see another primate is getting a banana. And guess what they do? They stop eating the cucumbers and they throw them at the researchers. It's not rational, but it is something that for whatever reason in our ancestral history and evolution, we as a species selected for. Pressure selected for us to be fair or have a sense of fairness. And so I share that because again, we're basing policy decisions to do nation states, to do cities, on something that is a normative theory but is not actually an empirical theory. In fact, there is a wonderful article from 2000 in the American Economic Journal that has 10 classic predictions from game theory, and they actually play out the game and see how people play them. It explains less than 30% of the observed behavior. You are better off flipping a coin than using game theory. And that's not to fault game theory. Again, it's what you should do if people were completely rational. But I want to submit to you that we as a species are not completely rational. We do have a sense of fairness. And so what I want to suggest to you is what's happening with the internet is just like how those monkeys, when you see cucumbers being given and you're okay with it up until the point where someone sees you have a banana and you reject it, the internet is allowing us to see that. And it's causing us to ask questions about what is fair. And it's raising questions that we've never been able to ask before, and that's really going to come to a crux in cities. And we need to think about how can we actually evolve a science, not a normative philosophy, on how to make things healthier, how to do job creation. Because yes, as Amy said, we need to create the future, but we don't actually have a science that allows us to predict what will create more jobs, what will actually create better livelihood. And then we're surprised when later it comes back and globalization doesn't rise all boats right away. The reality is if you're in a country with a strong currency like we are, those manufacturing jobs cannot compete overseas. And it's not that you want to devalue your currency, because that would create a whole other trouble too. But nobody actually ever said that globalization doesn't rise all boats automatically. It takes time. And as mentioned, automation. There is a report from McKinsey that says in the next 4 to 5 years, more than 50% of jobs will have some portion of the job automated. Now, that might be completely terrifying, except you pause and it's some portion of the job automated, not the entire job. And if you think about it, really what machine learning and AI does well is rote, repetitive actions. If your job is the same thing every day, doing the same thing, I would recommend trying to figure out what you do next, and that may actually raise questions about what cities can do to help you with that. Because rote and repetitive actions, unfortunately, probably will be sent to the machine. but questions about why, questions about creativity, questions about what should we do beyond the immediate, that is something that right now is still a human condition. And so these are the questions we need to ask. These are the questions we need forward. And again, I want to leave you with the idea that things are changing exponentially, and you too can be a change agent. So getting back to the fact that management, we have to meet expectations, leadership, we have to go out of it, it's worth noting that this is not a new thing. Back in ancient Greece, the elites were the ones that carried the flag in front of the melee army. And leadership literally means in Greek to be sent unto death. Because the flag bearer, of course, when it comes across another army, guess who's the first to die? The elites. Nelson Mandela said his most trying moment as a leader was actually when he had to turn to his own party, the African National Congress, and convince them to make peace with the white minority in South Africa when they really wanted to have a violent coup. He almost had a coup on his hands as well. Isaac Rabin, an Israeli, when he turned to his own fellow Israelis and said we need to make peace with the Palestinians, unfortunately was assassinated by a fellow Israeli. So I have to raise this coming back to the fact that we in the United States, we are a republic, we are a representative democracy. And the challenge is, we sometimes don't allow people to step outside of expectations. And when we don't allow them to step outside of expectations, we're actually hamstringing what we need to go going forward. And this is not to get any partisan, I'm nonpartisan myself, but I raise that because we need to think about how, one, we can be change agents, and then two, how we can champion change agents. Anybody know the story of Ensign Nimitz? A young Chester Nimitz in 1904 with the U.S. Navy ran his boat aground in the Philippines, the USS Decatur. He was court-martialed, but not drummed out of the Navy, and 35 years later he was one of only 2 5-star admirals we ever had in the U.S. Navy. Now play that out nowadays, 2009, runs his boat aground. How long on Twitter, how long on Facebook would have been fire Nimitz? How many news pundits and comedians would have been, how could he have possibly done it? And you can bet that him and probably his boss and maybe even his boss's boss would have been called before Congress and drummed out. And we would have been out a future 5-star admiral. I celebrate that the internet is making us more transparent. That is a good thing. But I wonder if it's making us more likely to judge an armchair quarterback, and as a result, less tolerant of people who make mistakes and learn from them. And as a result, are we selecting for people who are risk averse? At the end of the day, this is a question we need to ask about how we move forward together as a public. So as change agents, let me give you 3 quick theories to think about as to how you can thrive in this exponential era. First, there's a wonderful article from Harvard Business Review 2007 that says, in praise of incomplete leadership, that the best leaders know they have blind spots and actually encourage and champion people to point out those blind spots. I do this with my team at the FCC. I say, I like it when you bring data and say, David, you're missing this. Or I know you really want to go this way, but that might not be the best path because here's why. Effectively, you are crowdsourcing, searching that search space, and you are making yourself vulnerable to learning from others. And if you think about it, this is not too different than what venture capitalists do. They're not predicting the future, they're betting on the future, but they're looking around for optimal ways to move forward. In some respects, they're open to having their blind spots pointing out, we need to do the same things as managers and leaders going forward. That means you need to have a diversity of cognitive thought to succeed. If everybody in an organization is thinking the same thing, you're in trouble. But diversity only works if you set shared goals up front. There's actually a study from 2002 with the National Academies of Science in which they took experts plus naive participants, and they saw which group did better at performing interesting tasks. And interestingly enough, experts plus naive participants beat experts. You might say, why? I mean, don't we need experts? And we do. But what we need is a diversity of experts. Frank Lloyd Wright, an amazing architect, awful engineer. His buildings are falling apart. What we really want is to pair Frank Lloyd Wright with a really good engineer, with a really good conservationist, and you'd have a better outcome than any one group alone. Second, we need to empower the edge. Back in 2000, I signed up for a little-known program at the Centers for Disease Control called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program. There were only 30 of us, and we existed because the sarin gas attacks had happened in Japan in the 1990s. The Agile Manifesto, for those of you who remember, do people know Agile development? We got a few developers. For those who don't, it's the idea that instead of doing like long 3 to 4 year projects, you want to do very short sprints, because you can make course corrections, you can realize if you're going in the wrong direction. The Agile Manifesto came out in March of 2001. So I was a big proponent of it. But I was being told, get back in your box, do the 5-year plan, follow into the enterprise architecture, and my rejection of that was, well, wait, we don't have a deal with the terrorists not to strike until we have a system online. We've got to get something. And as it was, fate was had it that I was scheduled to give a briefing to the CIA and the FBI on September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning as to what we would do technology-wise should a bioterrorism event happen. Of course, unfortunately, as tragedy hit 8:34, the world changed. We literally piled computers into cars, and we dealt with the response to 9/11. So down on October 1st, briefed the CIA and the FBI on October 3rd. First case of anthrax shows up in Florida 24 hours later. But fortunately, because we had pushed out a minimal viable product using agile development, we were able to electronically handle lab test results, more than 1 million lab test results that month in October and November, as opposed to having to do it by faxes, which would have been, quite frankly, awful. That said, I vowed that I would never be a top-down leader because I saw that there is value in the edge and the fact that the edge knows their context the best. But we are rewarding leaders who are top-down right now. That's still how MBAs are trained. That's still how Masters of Public Policy are trained. We're told that we're supposed to enforce our views and actually force them downwards, as opposed to saying to the edge, look, you know your context the best. I'll give you autonomy. I'll give you meaningful mission. And I'll even give you measurable progress. But I'll serve as your flak jacket so you can move with speed. And I would say for cities, that is more important now than ever, that we empower the edge as opposed to trying to be top-down. And then last and finally, we need to think about ecosystem approaches. Think about it. You don't tell ants where to go. You sprinkle sugar in certain places, you sprinkle poison in other places, and they actually eventually figure out to avoid the poison and go for the sugar, but you never explicitly said go to A to B to C to D. Increasingly, we're going to be working for teams that are horizontal in nature that we don't directly control. In the private sector, if you try to be horizontal, it's hard, because you're either A, eating into your own profit model, or B, you're actually challenging and actually creating something that looks like an antitrust situation. Same thing is true in the public sector. You go back to the founders. 1788, James Madison said, "What is government but the greatest reflection of humanity? If all men and women were angels, no government would be necessary." And what he was advocating for is actually to use ambition to check ambition. The reward system right now in public service is actually about turf building, which is not a good thing when you actually have to address the issues we face today that don't fit into any one department or agency, but span departments and agencies. At the federal level, there are only a few things that actually are considered felonies, but one of them is if I use my money to help another agency without it also benefiting my agency, that is a felony. And so are we surprised that the horizontal collaborations that we need to occur aren't happening? We need to think about that going forward. So with those thoughts, and with huge thanks for each of you for being change agents, to be here, to brave the cold, and to think about how we can bring the future of the cities forward to a more sort of, again, acting globally, thinking locally, have the city perspective color what you do around the world because we are connected increasingly as a planet. I thank you for your time. We're going to need more change agents now more than ever. Thanks very much.